Two Italian immigrants convicted of murder, a court case riddled with controversy, an international cause. But were the men innocent or guilty? The answer is hard to find. I learned about Sacco and Vanzetti. I know I learned about Sacco and Vanzetti in school, but I will be honest, I can't remember much of it. The best I could tell you is that I learned that two anarchists were accused of a crime, had a controversial trial, and then they were executed. I don't believe that I learned the intimate details of what made this case special. If I did, I apologize to my teachers for being wrong. However, having only a limited knowledge base made learning about this case even better. Also, I'm preemptively apologizing for any of my pronunciations. It's not a strength. The fascinating thing about this story is that at times it's the personal tale of Sacco and Vanzetti and their fight for freedom. On the other hand, much of it is about the larger story of America. It's about a country dealing with the fallout of World War I, the fight for workers' rights, the influx of new immigrant demographics, and the mixing of different ideologies. It's unlikely the case of Sacco and Vanzetti would have occurred at any other time in American history. Before getting into the nitty gritty of the case details, let me provide a quick overview of what happened. On the afternoon of April 15th, 1920, in Braintree, Massachusetts, wages for the Slate and Morrill Shoe Company were ready to be delivered to employees. Around 3 o'clock, Assistant Paymaster Frederick Parmenter and security guard Alessandro Barardelli picked up the money for delivery. Suddenly, two gunmen charged the street, firing at the two employees. Both Parmenter and Barardelli fell, but when Barardelli went down, a gunman stood over him, firing more shots. Barardelli died on the spot. Parmenter was carried away to a nearby home, then to a hospital. He died the next morning. Barardelli was 44, married, and had two children. Parmenter was 45 and also had a wife and two children. The bandits jumped into a getaway car, a Buick, with three accomplices waiting inside. The car sped away and at one point crossed railroad tracks in South Braintree, forcing the guard to let them cross before a train. They were then forced to wait another train stop later. The rail guard at the second stop noted that the car threw tacks on the road after crossing. Braintree police did not own a car to chase the bandits, so they couldn't go after them anyway. The Buick was later found abandoned in the woods, with tire tracks from a second car leading away. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested for the crime on May 5th, 1920. To understand what led to Sacco and Vanzetti's arrests, you must first understand who they were and the social circles in which they found themselves. To begin with, both Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants. They arrived in America at the same time in 1908, but did not know one another initially. If most people were asked to picture Italian immigrants in the early 20th century, they'd likely picture someone poor trying to make a better life for themselves. That wasn't the case for either Nicola Sacco or Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Both men came from families that had successful businesses. Neither was trying to escape poverty. Nicola Sacco was born in southern Italy in 1891 to a loving family that owned an olive oil business. The family business was successful and they owned a vineyard. Nick would leave school in his teenage years to help run the family's business. Nick seemed happy with his life. Things changed when his older brother returned home from the Italian army and declared that he wanted to go to America. Nick thought this was a great idea and decided to join him. He was 17 when he left for America. Bartolomeo Vanzetti was born in 1888 in northern Italy. His father was a successful farmer and owned a cafe in town. Bart was raised by a loving mother who encouraged his love of books and learning. However, at the age of 13, his father decided Bart needed to learn how to be a baker to help run the cafe. So, his father sent him away to learn the trade. Bart would spend the next 6 years of his life away from home working grueling hours. He hated his time learning to be a baker, and his health suffered as a result. At age 19, Bart suffered pleurisy and was taken home by his parents. There, his mother nurtured him back to health. This time at home was some of the happiest in Bart's life, but it would have a sad ending when his mother would die from cancer not long after Bart himself recovered. He took the death of his mother hard and fell into depression. Soon, he decided to leave for America in 1908. America in the early 20th century was seeing a shift in immigrant population. Where immigrants used to come from places like Ireland and Germany, they now came from Italy and Russia. Anytime America has seen a shift in immigrant populations, it has seen a subsequent pushback against those people. The Germans saw it, the Irish saw it, and now the Italians were seeing it. This means that when Sacco and Vanzetti arrived on American soil, they were viewed as unwelcome guests who should return home. To gauge the strength of the anti-immigrant sentiment, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 was passed to limit the number of immigrants entering the country. It was a response to the large number of Italian and Eastern European immigrants entering America. Both Sacco and Vanzetti initially began working a series of menial jobs in America after their arrival. However, Sacco soon took on a trade. He learned how to be a shoemaker. More specifically, he learned how to be an edge trimmer. He would end up working for the Milford Shoe Company in 1910. He would work as an edge trimmer until his arrest. This job led to general prosperity for Sacco. I don't think he would be considered wealthy, but he was well off and able to provide for his family, which consisted of a wife and a son. He would also eventually have a daughter, but she was born after his arrest. Vanzetti struggled to find consistent work throughout his time in America. He went from job to job and never seemed satisfied at any location. He would end up as a fishmonger, the job he had when he was arrested. Reading about Vanzetti, two things become clear. First, he was never going to be happy in any job. He was meant to be an academic of some sort, since his sole passion was reading and learning. He was never going to be happy working at any manual labor job. I'm not going to sit here and judge him for that. Working conditions were brutal in those days. Also, the second thing becomes apparent is that Vanzetti was growing increasingly bitter. Vanzetti's bitterness seems to have led him down the path to anarchism, where Sacco would join him. This is surprising considering Sacco's success in America, but something about anarchism really appealed to Sacco. Both men became disciples of Luigi Galliani. Galliani was the premier Italian anarchist and ran a newspaper, Cronaca Sovversiva, in America that targeted anarchists. Sorry for my pronunciation. The paper would provide instructions for making bombs and encourage anarchists to take action. One notable headline read, "To hell with the Constitution," just to get a feel for who they were. For those unaware, anarchists seek a society without a government or any controlling group. They believe that through cooperation, people can achieve a proper balance and live happy, satisfied lives. These societies would require volunteer organizations and other groups to fulfill the role of government, minus the authority. For a portion of anarchists in the 20th century, achieving these ends often meant orchestrating acts of terrorism. On June 2nd, 1919, a series of bombs were set off in several cities across America. One bomb saw the bomber walk up to the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and detonate the device. The only casualty was the bomber. In Philadelphia, 2 bombs targeted a Catholic church. In Cleveland, the mayor's house was hit with a pipe bomb. Finally, Pittsburgh, Boston, New York, and New Jersey all saw homes hit with a bomb. The Postal Service also intercepted several more bombs before they could be delivered. The only casualty besides the one bomber was the maid of Senator Thomas Hardwick. Senator Hardwick was the intended target. Authorities managed to tie the attacks together because each location had copies of the same pink flyer. The flyer was signed by the anarchist fighters. So they gave themselves away like the wet bandits. Sacco and Vanzetti's participation in these terrorist attacks is a matter of debate, but their relationship to the likely perpetrators is not. Historian Bruce Watson had this to say: although no evidence exists proving that either Sacco or Vanzetti made or planted the bombs that terrorized America in 1919, their ties to the bombers gave them inside information and may have rendered them legally complicit in the conspiracy. They were friends with the DC bomber. They were arrested. He was lucky enough to have split up with them beforehand. Quick note: Buddha was arrested in Italy and served 5 years in prison, after which he began working for Mussolini. He operated as a spy, infiltrating anti-fascist groups in Switzerland and France. He was awarded for his service. Interesting turn for an anarchist. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants and anarchists. The American people would not perceive them well. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants and anarchists. The American people would not perceive them well. To make things worse, when World War I broke out, they fled to Mexico to avoid being drafted. Historians believe that during their flight to Mexico, Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants and anarchists. The American people would not perceive them well. To make things worse, when World War I broke out, they fled to Mexico to avoid being drafted. Historians believe that during their flight to Mexico in 1917, Sacco and Vanzetti met for the first time. They did not last long in Mexico and returned to the United States in short order. There is some debate as to why Sacco and Vanzetti fled to Mexico. Sacco claimed that the war was not about freedom, but about business, and that he had no desire to kill anyone who had not wronged him. Vanzetti also believed the war was not justified and declared himself a pacifist. However, fellow anarchist Joseph Moro believes that the men fled to be free to fight in the revolution Galliani had predicted would break out in Italy. They returned once the revolution failed to materialize. It's up to you to decide which one you believe. I bet you think it's time to get back into the crime that become so infamous in American history. Well, you'd be wrong. Another crime needs to be discussed because it is vital to the Sacco and Vanzetti case. On the morning of December 24th, 1919, there was an attempted robbery on a payroll delivery truck in the town of Bridgewater, Massachusetts. Witnesses disagreed on the number of robbers, their clothes, and their ethnicity. However, all witnesses agreed that one of the robbers had a mustache. Also notable is the idea that the robbers fled in a car, which witnesses identified as either a Hudson or a Buick. Months later, on April 16, 1920, Bridgewater Police Chief Michael Stewart was investigating an Italian immigrant anarchist named Ferruccio Coacci. Coacci had been arrested and released on a bond. He requested an extension to his bond because his wife was sick and required care. Interestingly enough, Coacci had recently worked at the Slate and World factory, the company that Sacco and Vanzetti would be accused of robbing. Upon visiting Coacci, police officers noticed that his wife was in perfect health and that Coacci was packing to leave. The officers arrested Coacci, and he was deported to Italy within 2 days. This set off alarm bells for Chief Stewart when he was told. Coacci seemed to be acting very strangely, and it was only a day after the South Braintree crime. Also, the fact that the Buick used in the South Braintree robbery was found less than 2 miles from Coacci's home made things even more suspicious. The Coacci investigation's biggest impact is likely that it led to the police to investigate his roommate, Mario Buda. Police believe that Buda's car could have been used in the South Braintree robbery as the vehicle that picked up the robbers after they discarded the Buick. Buda fled his home and was running from the police. However, his car was in the shop. The police told the shop owner, Simon Johnson, to notify them if Buda came to pick up the car. Buda came for his car on May 5, 1920. Mrs. Johnson quickly notified the police. But Buda did not come alone for his car. He arrived with some friends. Those friends included Sacco and Vanzetti. This would be the night the two men were arrested. Picking up their friend's car would be their last moments of freedom. The reason Buda needed his friends with him to pick up his car also plays a role in the story. Federal authorities in New York had recently arrested Sacco and Vanzetti's good friends, Roberto Elia and Andrea Salcedo. They were not being held in a jail, but in federal offices. Vanzetti would go to New York to visit others and discuss what was happening with Elia and Salcedo. Vanzetti received the news that government raids on suspected anarchist homes and hangouts were likely to start soon. I'm sure Sacco and Vanzetti took the situation seriously, but if they weren't, there'd be one disturbing event that would change things. On the morning of May 3rd, 1920, Andrea Salcedo's body was found on the pavement, having fallen from a window 14 floors above. There is no answer as to whether Salcedo was pushed or jumped. Salcedo's fellow prisoner, Elia, stated that the officers beat Salcedo and he was constantly watched. Either way, his arrest and treatment undoubtedly played a role in his death. Buda had the car they needed, but it was in the shop. So on May 5th, 1920, a group consisting of Buda, Sacco, Vanzetti, and a man named Riccardo Orciani gathered in Sacco's home before they made their way to the garage. Sacco's wife, Rosina, was packing because Sacco's family intended to return to Italy after he had just been notified about the death of his mother. After dinner, the men decided to leave. Vanzetti left armed with a fully loaded .38, while Sacco Mario Buda had the car they needed, but it was in the shop. So on May 5th, 1920, a group consisting of Buda, Sacco, Vanzetti, and a man named Riccardo Orciani gathered in Sacco's home before they made their way to the garage. Sacco's wife, Rosina, was packing because Sacco's family intended to return to Italy after he had just been notified about the death of his mother. After dinner, the men decided to leave. Vanzetti left armed with a fully loaded .38, while Sacco left with a loaded .32 Colt. Vanzetti also filled his pockets with shotgun shells that had been sitting on Sacco's counter. I'm not sure why he did that. The men arrived at the garage where Mrs. Johnson called the police. Buda's car wasn't ready, and even though he was initially insistent that he needed it, he eventually relented. So Buda and Orciani left riding on a motorcycle and sidecar, while Sacco and Vanzetti boarded a trolley. Police boarded the trolley at the next stop. Officer Michael Connolly confronted the men and then had arrested them both. They confiscated Vanzetti's gun, but did not find Sacco's until he reached the police station. Something important to note is that in the months after the arrest, Connolly would claim that Sacco and Vanzetti both went for their guns. He made no mention of this in the immediate aftermath of the arrest, and his partner, Officer Vaughn, also made no mention of such an event. Here's where things went from bad to worse for Sacco and Vanzetti. In the pre-Miranda days, neither Sacco nor Vanzetti knew their rights and decided to answer police questions. However, they lied repeatedly. They denied being friends with Mario Buddha or being at the garage to pick up his car. They also claimed they were not anarchists. The basis of these lies seems to be that neither Sacco nor Vanzetti knew why they were arrested. They weren't told. They believed they were arrested because of their anarchist associations. They were doing their best to separate themselves from those connections. These lies would cost them dearly. Police searched the homes of Sacco and Vanzetti and found anarchist materials. I don't know why they wouldn't remove this evidence from their own homes when they were trying to clean out their friends' places, but that must remain a mystery. The day after their arrest, they were questioned by District Attorney Frederick G. Katzman. Katzman didn't disclose the reason for their arrest, which meant Sacco and Vanzetti still believed they were under arrest for their anarchist ties. They continued to lie, trying to avoid disclosing their connections to the community. Historian Susan Tejada notes an event that, truthfully, in today's world, would be grounds for mistrial and would likely ruin the prosecution. See, Sacco asked Katzman for a lawyer, and Katzman ignored it. Sacco did not insist. Who knows what would be different if a lawyer had arrived early on in the case? Prosecution began building its case for both the Bridgewater robbery and the South Braintree robbery and murder. Frankly, it's unbelievable how they went about it. First, they went for fingerprints on the Buick. However, after the results came in, they decided the Buick was too contaminated, having been handled by many people before fingerprinting. It seems suspicious that this only mattered after the results were returned, but it is by no means definitive. Prosecution then turned to witnesses. Instead of multi-man lineups, police presented witnesses with each suspect alone. They made Sacco and Vanzetti dressed in clothes witnesses remembered seeing and had them pose in various stances, including a shooting stance. Even with this scenario, witnesses were split on identification. Sacco was cleared on the Bridgewater crime because he was working. However, he could not be cleared of the South Braintree crime. Vanzetti had no way to confirm his alibi as a self-employed fishmonger. He claimed that during the South Bridgewater robbery, he was selling eels because they are an important Italian Christmas Eve dish, but he couldn't prove it. Finally, I do want to note that Orciani was arrested, and his alibi proved he was working during both the Bridgewater and South Braintree crimes. For Katzman, the solution to the alibi issue was simple. Sacco was responsible only for the South Braintree crime, while Vanzetti was responsible for both Bridgewater and South Braintree. I guess that makes sense if you're determined to conclude that both men are criminals. Either way, Vanzetti was now charged with two separate criminal acts, while Sacco was charged with one. The trial of the Commonwealth versus Bartolomeo Vanzetti began on June 22, 1920. The judge in the case was Judge Webster Thayer. Thayer was 64 and experienced on the bench. Thayer might have been the worst possible judge for Vanzetti. Thayer had recently presided over a case involving an anarchist. When the accused was found not guilty, Thayer admonished the jury for their decision. Think about that. The judge got mad at the jury's decision. The prosecution's case relied heavily on their own witnesses and the story they created. The prosecution's witnesses kept pointing to Vanzetti as the man who had held a shotgun during the robbery in Bridgewater. Witnesses who had previously said they didn't really see the robbers now definitively pointed to Vanzetti. Others described a man with a close-cropped mustache, very different from Vanzetti's trademark facial hair. However, the jury didn't seem to notice these details. Maybe they were focused on the fact that witness after witness said the robbers were definitely not American. Some of the witnesses knew they weren't American because foreigners apparently run differently. Okay. The prosecution then began to focus on the shotgun shells Vanzetti was carrying since the robbers used a shotgun. They also said a cap found in Vanzetti's room matched one worn by the shotgun-wielding bandit. However, the pieces of information presented about the shotgun shells may have been the most damning. Jurors reported that once in the jury room, the foreman opened one of the two shells to prove it could kill a man. Apparently, there was a debate on whether you could call something attempted murder if a shotgun shell was a hunting shell. Several jurors later confirmed that this led them to declare Vanzetti guilty. When Judge Thayer learned of the event, he ordered the pellets returned to Katzman. Katzman told a jury to stay quiet about what happened. I wonder why. The defense relied on its own witnesses to argue that Vanzetti was selling eels on the day of the crime. Katzman was relentless in his cross-examination of the witnesses. He would ask the witnesses to go over their stories again, then ask unrelated questions they could not answer, like what they were doing at 4:30 p.m. on the 22nd. I guess if you can't answer that, then how do you know where you were on the day of the crime? Vanzetti had been living with an Italian family and had struck up a sort of surrogate father relationship with the family's 13-year-old son, Beltrando. Vanzetti would have Beltrando help him with his fishmonger business. Beltrando took the stand for the defense. After telling his tale of helping Vanzetti on the day of the crime, Katzman began his cross-examination. He began by asking questions unrelated to the crime to make Beltrando seem forgetful. Katzman accused Beltrando of having memorized and practiced his story. The defense witnesses' flaw were twofold. One, they were all Italians who spoke limited English, so this did not endear them to the jury. Furthermore, their story seemed practiced and rehearsed, leading the jury to believe that the Italian community was coming together to help one of its own. Finally, there was no evidence, including receipts or bills of sales, showing the date. Katzman also noted that eels were often salted a day before eating, so wouldn't they have been purchased on the 23rd? Were the witnesses confusing the dates? Katzman raised many doubts in the jurors. Vanzetti was found guilty of assault with the intent to murder and assault with intent to rob. Judge Thayer sentenced Vanzetti to 12 to 15 years based on the intent to rob conviction. This may have been done to block future moves by the defense after the jury messed with the shotgun shells. It wouldn't be shocking that Thayer had this in mind considering his distaste for Anarchist. Vanzetti did not take the stand in his own defense. The reason he did not take the stand is a matter of debate. Vanzetti stated that his attorney, John Vahey, advised against it because of the risk that Vanzetti's anarchist beliefs would become a focal point. However, Vahey's assistant, James Graham, claims that Vahey left the decision up to Vanzetti, who chose not to, believing he could not improve on his alibi. I'm not sure which is true, but it's unlikely Vanzetti's testimony could have changed anything. Vanzetti was bitter towards Vahey after losing the trial. Now it was time for both Sacco and Vanzetti to face trial together. Unluckily, they drew Judge Thayer again. I say it was unlucky, but actually luck had nothing to do with it. Thayer had been scheduled to preside over another case, but he requested a change to the Sacco and Vanzetti case. I don't think a judge should be able to request to preside over a case, especially when he had just sentenced one of the defendants for another crime. It just seems wrong to me. Sacco and Vanzetti had a group of friends and supporters making up their defense committee. The committee decided the best lawyer for the job was Fred Moore. Moore was a disastrous pick. As Watson put it, before he left, Moore would be accused of blackmail, coercing witnesses, and entrenching the opposition with his careless manners and morals. To make matters even worse, Moore infuriated Thayer every time he spoke. To quote Tejada, in the first few days of the trial, before a single syllable of the opening statements had been uttered, Webster Thayer revealed such a visceral antipathy to Fred Moore that it would become the stuff of legend. Other attorneys were working the case as well, with William Callahan representing Sacco and brothers Thomas and J.J. McCartney representing Vanzetti, but Moore was overall in charge. Who was Fred Moore, and why did he infuriate Thayer? Moore had gained notoriety by taking part in several successful industrial workers of the world trials in which workers were accused of bombings and other offenses. However, I stress that he took part because he was never the lead, and he was often a smaller part of the team. When he was in charge, he was not nearly as successful. In fact, a year before the Sacco and Vanzetti case, Moore lost his defense of 26 defendants because he was focused on another trial and came unprepared. Making matters worse, he failed to file an appeal in the 90-day window. He was fired from the IWW. He likely took the Sacco and Vanzetti case to save his career. Moore wasn't all bad. He did an excellent job of public relations for the two accused men. He seemed to understand that public perception of this case was critical, so he made sure favorable journals wrote sympathetic pieces. While the public relations could not save Sacco and Vanzetti, his early efforts to publicize the case are likely why they are remembered. Moore's greatest mistake is not necessarily one I can blame him for, because the situation is so outlandish, I'm not sure how he could have been prepared for it. On January 2nd, 1921, a woman named Angelina DeFalco, who claimed to be an Italian-American court interpreter, approached Aldino Feliciani, a member of the defense committee. She had a proposition. If the committee paid her the proper amount, she would secure the acquittal of Sacco and Vanzetti. She apparently had multiple contacts within the DA's office, including the brother of the DA. She also had a contact within the Norfolk County Superior Court through a clerk and attorney named Francis Squires. DeFalco stated that to avoid convictions, defendants had to pay her and the ring of which she was a member. Tejada lays out the plan as such. Sacco and Vanzetti would work out this way, DeFalco said. For $50,000 with $10,000 down, Percy Katzman would take the case. Then his brother, the district attorney, would assign an assistant to prosecute. The jury foreman would be paid to fix the jury. Sacco would be acquitted. While DeFalco believed she could get both men acquitted, she knew Vanzetti would be tougher due to his prior conviction. DeFalco invited Feliciani to dinner at her house to go over the deal. When Moore learned of this, he told Feliciani not to attend. Feliciani did not officially attend the dinner, however, he did check things out. He saw Fred Katzman's car, Percy Katzman's car, and Squire's car. Moore decided the best course of action was to have DeFalco arrested. She was charged with soliciting law business while not an attorney. The Katzmans and Squires say they only knew her from the occasional use of DeFalco as an interpreter. The charges were eventually dismissed with no one in trouble. It is hard to say if DeFalco's offer was real. Neither Tejada nor Watson can claim with certainty that it was real, but DeFalco was arrested in 1931 for trying to get paid to free another prisoner. She collected $1,550 on that scheme. Moore's decision to go public with the information proved to be a disaster. It placed him at war with Katzman, making things personal. And it implied corruption in the court, which something Judge Thayer took personally as well. The trial is about to begin. So let's start with jury selection. Jury selection began on May 31st, 1921, and it ended just after midnight on June 4th. Selection went beyond the initial pool of 500 possible jurors. Sheriffs literally went door to door finding men to serve on the jury. There were moments of humor. One man had both Sacco and Vanzetti laughing so hard they were in tears because he tried, unsuccessfully, to prove he was deaf. The jurors were eventually chosen and shown their temporary living quarters for the trial, a basement room in the probate court filled with cots. That must have been fun. Since we are now entering the trial, I want to take a quick moment to go over how I plan to handle it. I will summarize the following areas: prosecution witnesses, defense witnesses, and physical evidence. If I went into detail on each, it would make this very, very, very long, and it is already going to be longer than my normal stuff. If you want the full version of everything, please check out my sources. Check them out anyway, please. Okay, back to the trial. Sacco's alibi is that on the afternoon of the South Braintree murders, he was in the Italian consulate. Sacco was preparing to go back to Italy following the death of his mother and needed a passport. He initially used a photo of himself, his wife, and his son, but had to get a smaller picture for the passport. Unfortunately, the man Sacco met with at the consulate, Giuseppe Andrauer, was now back in Italy. He was hunted down by defense, confirmed that Sacco was indeed in the consulate on the 15th between 2 and 3 p.m. The man remembers the large photo Sacco presented. Andrauer signed an affidavit, but would not leave Italy unless paid. He never made it to America for trial. Undoubtedly, the fact that Andrauer did not show up in person hurt Sacco. Vanzetti claimed that he was selling fish from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m., after which he bought a piece of suiting material, which involved bringing the salesman to meet his former landlady, for some reason. He also then talked to a fisherman for about an hour. Everyone confirmed the story with the fisherman, Melvin Coral, stating Vanzetti arrived at 2 and then left at 3:30, meaning he could not have committed the crime. The trial would feature over 150 people taking the stand either as witnesses or experts. The prosecution's witnesses would consist of people identifying Sacco and Vanzetti as the men they saw that day in Braintree. The defense witnesses would either be there to discredit the prosecution's witnesses or state that they saw the men in different locations. The prosecution's witnesses followed a pattern. When initially questioned after the crime, they could not place the men who committed it, but once in court, they were sure it was Sacco and Vanzetti. No witness for the prosecution exemplified the process more than Lola Andrews. Andrews took the stand and identified Sacco as a man standing around the Slate Moral factory who provided her directions. Moore tried to question her about the discrepancies between her court testimony and earlier statements, but he made a mistake. He inadvertently led Andrews in the direction where, in her testimony, she described Moore promising her a vacation and a job as a bribe. It likely did not go down exactly as Andrews described, but the damage was done. 5 defense witnesses refuted her testimony. Andrews really is the perfect example of the style of the majority of the prosecution's witnesses. They either change their statements dramatically over time or are later discredited by multiple defense witnesses. That's not to say all the prosecution's witnesses majorly changed their stories or were discredited, but enough of them were that when you read about the case, you start to notice the pattern. To be slightly fair to the prosecution, there was one witness, Harry Dolbear, who was called as a juror but dismissed after recognizing Vanzetti. Where did he see Vanzetti? In a dusty car downtown with 4 other men. His testimony was not challenged, and he was sure it was Vanzetti. That is to say that some of the prosecution's witnesses were sure they saw Sacco and Vanzetti, and their testimony could not be dismissed. One last example of a poor prosecution witness is Lewis Wade. Wade worked at Slate Moral. He identified Sacco as the shooter at the police station, but on the stand he changed his mind and said he didn't think it was Sacco. Apparently, Wade had recently seen a man in a barbershop who looked exactly like the shooter. Judge Thayer told the jury this change in confession didn't exonerate Sacco. Instead, it was a negative against Wade's credibility. Speaking of Thayer, if you were wondering where he stood on everything, here's a quick example. Thayer would talk to reporters during midday breaks, where he was apparently quite animated and angry regarding the defense. He is quoted as having said, "You wait till I give my charge to the jury, I'll show them." I say quoted, but not reported, because reporters kept this quiet for quite some time. Thayer really hated Moore. As I wrap up the witness portion, I need to point out 2 facts. First is that no witness placed both men at the crime scene. Second, nobody said they saw Vanzetti actively taking part in the shooting. He was always seen in the car after the robbers escaped. Numerous witnesses stated Sacco was a shooter. It may appear that I did not discuss the defense witnesses, but their roles were either to discredit the prosecution's witnesses or confirm the 2 men's alibis, so I essentially did cover them in this section. Actual physical evidence was sparse. I've already covered how the police discarded the fingerprint results since they were contaminated. This left Sacco and Vanzetti's guns, the bullets pulled from the bodies, and a cap. The cap apparently belonged to Sacco. A worker at Slate Moral, Fred Loring, claimed he found the cap on the street near the bodies. The idea was that the hat had been found right after the killings. However, after the trial, it was discovered that the cap had been found more than 24 hours after the crime. The hat was allowed to be entered into evidence based solely on the fact that Sacco wore a hat of a similar color. I don't think that's great evidence. The story of Vanzetti's gun might be one of the most insane parts of the trial. The prosecution developed a theory that the gun Vanzetti had on him the night of his arrest was a gun he stole from Berardelli's body. Apparently, Berardelli carried a gun with him while on the job, but wasn't found with one. The thing is, the gun repair shop had originally identified the gun Berardelli carried as a .32 caliber weapon. Vanzetti was arrested with a .38 caliber. How did the prosecution explain the difference? The repair person made a mistake in its identification. Also, the gun was in the shop for repairs. Was the repairman sure it was returned to Berardelli? The repairman couldn't find it, so it must have been delivered. If that were the end of the story for Vanzetti's gun, it would seem ridiculous, but that's it. However, the police files were released in 1977. Files revealed that Chief Stewart had interviewed Berardelli's wife Sarah, wherein she told him that the gun her husband carried was given to him on paydays by Parmenter. Furthermore, Stewart found the record of sale for Parmenter's gun, which shows that a .32 caliber gun was purchased. It also provided the gun's serial number. The serial number did not match Vanzetti's gun. Seems likely that this was the gun lent to Berardelli for his job, and even more likely that the prosecution knew about it and told no one, including the defense. This is a big deal. That's extremely important evidence. The gun Sacco was found with did not go on a Vanzetti-like wild ride, but the bullets from the gun became a focal point for the trial. Before we get there, I want to note that Sacco claimed he was armed because he intended to go shooting in the woods with Vanzetti. Okay. Before the trial, the prosecution had indicated they weren't going to link Sacco's gun to the precise bullets pulled from Berardelli. But that proved to be a lie once the proceedings began. Prosecution claimed that the bullet that killed Berardelli was from a .32 Colt automatic pistol, which was the same model as Sacco's gun. Oddly enough, the other 5 bullets pulled from the body were not from a Colt. I, I don't know how that works. This led to both sides having their experts test the gun to see if the bullets matched. Sacco actually approved these tests, feeling confident. 2 experts for the prosecution, a captain in the state police and an employee of the Remington Company ballistics department, claimed that the bullet that killed Berardelli was consistent with the bullets that Sacco's pistol would fire. There was no definitive, but there was consistency. They also noted that one of the other bullets collected could have come from Sacco's gun. The defense had its own experts who said the bullet did not come from Sacco's gun. The defense's experts were a ballistic engineer for the United States Cartridge Company and the director of the testing room for the Colt Company. There was one hiccup in the defense analysis. The bullet found in the case was a Winchester, but the defense's experts used U.S. cartridges, not Winchester. They believed that the U.S. cartridges were closer to the bullet in the case than any of the current Winchester ones they could find. But that had to register to the jury that the bullets were different. They used a different brand. The bullets would remain controversial. For some reason, the jury foreman, Walter Ripley, felt the need to bring in 3 of his own .38 caliber shells so that other jurors could compare them to Sacco's. I'm fairly certain that goes against some rule or regulation, but somehow it flew under the radar until after the trial. The bullets from Sacco's gun were tested again in 1927, 1944, 1961, 1982, and 1983. The results of 1944 are unknown and 1982 was inconclusive, but the other 3 years all had the bullet that killed Berardelli coming from Sacco's gun. That's pretty damning. However, a theory developed soon after the trial that the bullets being evaluated were substituted at some point in time. But of course, there is a flaw in that argument. The defense also tested Sacco's bullets. If they had been switched, why did the defense say the bullets came from a different gun? Shouldn't they have matched up? The controversy was not just about Sacco's bullets, but also his gun. In 1988, a newspaper reporter, Charles Whipple, reported that in 1937, Sergeant Edward J. Seibel of the Boston Police Department claimed to have switched the weapon in the murder case. Whipple waited 50 years to tell this because he was young and timid in the 30s, and the sergeant claimed he would deny the statement. It sounds outlandish, but there was drama about the gun during the appeal process. At some point in the appeal hearings, the defense expert, Albert Hamilton, took apart not only Sacco's gun, but also his own 2 revolvers to prove how easy it could be done. I'm not sure why he did that, to be honest. It doesn't matter. When Hamilton went to look at Sacco's gun again after that incident, he suddenly noted it had a new barrel. Had someone switched it? Making things more complicated was the fact that the guns were under lock and key. Also, the switched barrel apparently fits with one of Hamilton's guns. Had he done it? Had the prosecution? Was it to win the case or was it an honest mistake? There is no answer. It's just another wild moment in the story. This is all to say that the physical evidence was a mess, and no one can definitely claim to be guilty or innocent based off of it. Sacco and Vanzetti did take the stand for the trial. Each had to defend the lies they told police upon arrest. They also had to defend their decision to flee to Mexico when the U.S. joined the war. It quickly becomes apparent that their testimony was not about the crime for which they were charged, but the fact that they were anarchists who dodged the draft. They had to defend their convictions and beliefs. On July 14th, 1921, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for both men. Sacco yelled that he was innocent and that they were killing innocent men. Judge Thayer thanked the jury for its service and released them. He did not set down a sentence. That would wait until after a very lengthy appeal process, which was the rules for Massachusetts. I wasn't sure how to cover the appeal process for Sacco and Vanzetti because, while it's interesting, it ultimately fails for one reason. In Massachusetts in the 1920s, the judge who presided over your case also presided over your appeals. This meant that every time Sacco and Vanzetti's lawyers appealed, they had to go to Judge Thayer. That is one of the most absurd laws I've ever heard. I know it's been changed. How could they hope for a fair appeal? They could not raise the issue of Thayer's bias because he was denied it existed. If they questioned any procedural issue, he shut it down because it would have occurred under his watch. They did get to appeal their case to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts at one point, but they were unsuccessful. It's also important to note that Moore was essentially removed from the defense team after the initial trial. William J. Thompson and Herbert B. Ehrman would replace him. There is one moment in the appeal process that needs to be separated. It is when Celestino Medeiros wrote a letter to Sacco confessing that he was the real perpetrator of the crime. Medeiros was currently in jail for killing a bank teller, but he felt the need to confess because old Mrs. Sacco visiting her husband felt bad. Madeira's story led the defense to Joe Morelli and his brothers. Morelli was a career criminal, and he looked astonishingly like Sacco. There was some support around the idea that Morelli was responsible for the crime, but unfortunately Madeira's story had holes in it and had changed. He didn't really know the area, claimed the money was in a black bag, but it was in a box. He also had the wrong caliber gun. So, in the end, Thayer dismissed his confession. Thayer insinuated that Medeiros was essentially bribed by Sacco and Vanzetti and their considerable defense fund. The Morelli storyline also remained mired in controversy. Joe Morelli apparently confessed the murders to a cellmate in 1923 and made the cellmate swear to provide an alibi for Morelli. In 1931, Morelli confessed to the crime again, but in 1935, he denied it once more. Then Joe Morelli even began claiming he knew Sacco and Vanzetti and saying they were involved in multiple crimes. Joe Morelli's brother, Frank, claimed in 1973 that he and Joe were part of the Braintree robbery and that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent and took the fall. He said it in a very braggadocious manner, so keep that in mind. The brothers could not keep their own story straight. And I want to point out again, there's also the fact that Joe Morelli looks startlingly like Nicola Sacco. It even confused some witnesses. Who knows the role the Morellis played in the crime? It would fit the way the gang operated in their typical MO, but obviously there was never concrete evidence placing the Morellis at the crime. They claimed they were both guilty and innocent. The only thing certain is that they added another layer of debate to the whole case. Sacco and Vanzetti added to the drama surrounding the appeal process. Neither man seemed to handle being jailed well. Sacco started in rough shape, never mentally adjusting to imprisonment. He felt people were out to get him, and when he was allowed to work in this prison shoe shop, he thought the other prisoners were attacking him, because one prisoner tossed a heel to another, but it wound up going in Sacco's general direction. He then went on a hunger strike. He even hurt himself at points. He wound up in a psychiatric hospital. After generally improving, he went back to jail. Vanzetti was actually doing well at the start of his sentence, but things eventually devolved for him as well. He began claiming that Mussolini had men out to get him. Not sure where he got that idea. He also found himself in a psychiatric hospital. It may have seemed like Vanzetti originally did this to get nicer accommodations of the hospital, but 3 doctors concluded he was suffering from hallucinations and delusions. However, while he was in the hospital, those delusions went away, so he returned to jail. In 1927, with their appeals exhausted, Sacco and Vanzetti were sentenced to death by electric chair. Their last hope would come from a possible pardon or commutation by Massachusetts Governor Alva Fuller. Fuller did not feel confident in deciding such a high-profile case alone, so he assembled a committee. On the committee were probate judge Robert Grant, physicist, engineer, and MIT president Samuel Stratton, and Harvard University president Abbott Lawrence Lovell. The committee heard from both the prosecution and defense. The defense argued that Thayer was biased and could not preside over a fair trial. They also provided the committee with evidence that the prosecution's witnesses' testimony changed from the immediate aftermath to their time at court. The defense had actually been given the minutes to the original inquest into the 1919 robbery and 1920 Braintree crime. They had not received these before the committee hearings, so not at the original trial. The defense also found new evidence that they believe exonerated Vanzetti. The defense attorney somehow found a receipt for eels sent to Vanzetti during the time frame needed to show Vanzetti was selling eels. Thompson and Ehrman believed this was a magical piece of evidence for Vanzetti, but it wasn't brought up again after it was delivered to the committee. That piece of evidence would appear to be a big deal, but the committee ignored it, and it never became a real major point for the defense. Also, finding an 8-year-old receipt out of nowhere isn't impossible, but it does raise some eyebrows if I'm being honest. On August 3rd, 1927, Governor Fuller made his decision based on the committee's finding. Sacco and Vanzetti would not be pardoned or see their sentences reduced. They would be executed. The committee basically dismissed all claims of bias and believed the prosecution's witnesses. The committee was also influenced by the original jurors. Jurors believed that Thayer to be fair and did not detect any bias in him. Sacco and Vanzetti would be executed by the electric chair on August 23rd, 1927. Sacco was 36, survived by his wife and 2 children. Vanzetti was 38 and survived by his sister and family in Italy. Both men maintained their innocence until death. Executed alongside them was Medeiros, the man who had once tried to save them via his own confession. What makes the case of Sacco and Vanzetti stand out is the reaction it elicited, not only in the United States, but also abroad. Groups rallied around them, and massive crowds gathered to hear the news and shout their support. Some organizations in America saw the two men as symbols they could hold up to better their cause. Not all of these groups had the two men's best interests at heart. One communist woman is reported as having said, "Who wants them saved? What earthly good will they do to us alive?" I guess the cause comes before common decency. Generally speaking, the international community supported the two men. Historian Moshik wrote, "Perhaps no other event until the Vietnam War evoked as much anti-American sentiment among non-Americans who were otherwise prone to hold a favorable view of the United States." Paris had violent riots led by communists on August 27, 1927 because of Sacco and Vanzetti. While hunting down anarchists in the Soviet Union, Stalin had a factory dedicated to the men. The irony, of course, being that the two men were, in fact, anarchists. These examples are important because they show how Sacco and Vanzetti became symbols for different groups. Those groups all had their own agendas. The rest of the world was also outraged at the idea of American justice. France, Germany, Mexico, England all had large groups protesting the case. It became a unifying factor among many groups in those countries. They all agreed that the men should be released. The U.S. reputation was taking a major hit because of this case. America was divided on the issue. Some felt the men were guilty, while others believed they had been railroaded because of their beliefs and associations. The Red Scare of the 1920s doomed the two men in the eyes of many. When you look at how the prosecutors focused on Sacco and Vanzetti's ideological beliefs, it's hard to deny that the men were charged because of what they believed. Italian leader Benito Mussolini did try to secure the release of the two men. He discreetly approached U.S. authorities, hoping to persuade them. There are both likely political and personal reasons for this. Politically, if he could free the men, it would satisfy a large segment of his country's population. But as Stalin points out, he also likely felt a sense of kinship with the two men. I wonder what Vanzetti would have thought about Mussolini trying to get him free, considering he thought Mussolini was sending men after him. So that is the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, the story of robbery, murder, and questionable justice. Were they guilty? It's hard to say. The case presented in court doesn't appear to prove they were without a shadow of a doubt. In fact, it looks like they were railroaded. However, they definitely hung out with people guilty of bombings and other crimes, and they weren't the angels some tried to make them out to be. Their former defense attorney, Fred Moore, had concluded that the men were guilty. Moore had even written to Upton Sinclair stating that he had framed the alibis for Sacco and Vanzetti. Sinclair did not believe Moore, citing his drug use and bitterness after being dismissed from the case. We also have the weird bullet evidence. Either someone switched out the bullets being analyzed or Sacco's gun was used in the crime. Both raise their own questions. However, all this means is that at the end of the day, we will never truly know their guilt or innocence. Here's where I go over the sources used. I primarily use 4 books in this episode. First, there's Susan Tejada's In Search of Sacco and Vanzetti, Double Lives, Troubled Times, and the Massachusetts murder case that shook the world. This book is fantastic and really highlights who Sacco and Vanzetti were as people. We get their backstories along with their interactions they had with their families. It makes the entire case feel more personal and more real. She also organizes her book in a manner that's easy to follow, so anyone looking to review a specific portion of the case can easily find it. I also found her to be fair in her presentation, as she never shied away from evidence that could help or hurt the two men. Finally, it is an easy read for casual history fans. It won't feel like a slog to get through it. I also use Bruce Watson's Sacco and Vanzetti, The Men, the Murders, and the Judgment of Mankind. Watson isn't as personal as Tejada, but he's no less engaging. He also focuses more on the anarchist roots than Tejada does, which is appreciated. Watson more clearly notes that the two men were friends with violent people who committed crimes. Watson also states that the two men would have known about several crimes. This is important because while it doesn't change the case's narrative, it helps you understand the people involved. Truthfully, Tejada and Watson are great complementary reads, as each covers areas the other may lack. I would say it's close to Tejada in terms of readability. Paul Avrich's Sacco and Vanzetti, the anarchist background, is a great introduction to the beliefs of Sacco and Vanzetti. He covers the people who influenced Sacco and Vanzetti as well as their friends. It doesn't really help with the actual case details, but it's great for understanding the two men and the times in which they existed. For the most part, this is an easy book to get through, but some might find it more academic at points. Finally, there is Moshik Temin's The Sacco-Vanzetti Affair, America on Trial. This book looks at the international reaction to Sacco and Vanzetti's case. Like Avrich's book, this book won't help you understand the intimate details of the case. However, it provides insight into why the case became so popular and well known. It also gives the reader insight into the trial's great implications and why it was never just about Sacco and Vanzetti. I would say this is a bit more of an academic read for those interested. That's everything. That's my episode today. I know it was a bit of a longer one. Please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and hopefully you tune in next time. Thank you.